Even if we don't know it, many of us believe myths about science. Most of these we picked up innocently from the culture around us or by people who were repeating them and simply did not know any better. There are so many of these myths, in fact, that they number in the hundreds. Given this, I cannot adequately cover even a small percentage in this video, so I'm narrowing it down to 5 whoppers from the history and sociology of science. If you enjoyed this video, please like and subscribe below. And with that said, let's get on with it. Number 1. There was no scientific progress made in the Dark Ages. It is a commonly held belief that, between the fall of the Western Roman Empire and the Italian Renaissance, no intellectual progress happened in Western Europe. This belief is extremely pervasive. It has been repeated in documentaries by people such as the great science popularizer Carl Sagan and skeptical educator Brian Dunning. Despite the popularity of this claim, however, it's been known to be false by historians of science in the Middle Ages for over a century. Even in the darkest days of the Middle Ages, following the overthrow of Romulus Augustulus and the collapse of the Roman Empire in 476, there was progress made in things like agriculture. Innovations in plow technology and crop rotation happened during this time, as did the advent of the grain mill. While grain mills had existed since the ancient world, they had never been that popular. During the Middle Ages, however, they started to pop up everywhere. Later on in the Middle Ages, there were huge contributions to learning and nature knowledge. It was during the Middle Ages in which schools like Oxford and Cambridge were founded. It was also during this time in which the foundations of algebra were introduced into Europe from the Islamic world. Many ideas which would lay the foundations for later thinkers, such as Galileo and Copernicus, also popped up at this time. The best example of this is the mean speed theorem. This theorem, which is widely attributed to Galileo, was in fact proved in the Middle Ages before he was even born. Given the large debt that the founders of modern science have to medieval thinkers and the ideas that were developed in the Middle Ages, there is a non-trivial number of historians who dispute the idea that there was a scientific revolution. Instead of there being a dramatic revolution and a break-off from classical learning, it is argued that the ideas of the founders of modern science were in fact a continuation of classical learning from the Middle Ages. Rather than throwing everything that was done in the Middle Ages in the garbage can, these men instead built and improved upon these ideas. This idea in history is known as the continuity thesis. Number 2. Christopher Columbus sailed around the world in 1492 to prove that the Earth was not flat. If you're like me, you've heard this one since you were a child. In fact, I had a whole lesson in the 2nd grade discussing Christopher Columbus, and it absolutely perpetuated this myth. While this is a commonly held belief, it in fact is not based in reality. People have known since ancient Greece that the Earth is round. This knowledge was never lost in Europe. People ranging from the church fathers such as St. Augustine and St. Jerome, to the greatest theologians of the Middle Ages such as Bacon and Aquinas all agreed that the Earth was a sphere. They inherited this thought from the thinkers of the ancient world in which they admired most, namely Aristotle and Ptolemy. Instead of sailing to prove that the Earth was round, Columbus was simply trying to find a quicker route to Asia. He thought that this could be done by sailing westward. This was because Columbus argued others had greatly overestimated the size of the Earth. Number 3. Galileo Galilei was tortured and imprisoned by the Catholic Church for preaching heliocentrism. While most of us are convinced that we know what happened to Galileo, there are in fact many popular misunderstandings about his life and trial. The biggest of these is that he was tortured and imprisoned. This was done, the story goes, because he defended Copernicus against the Catholic Church. The biggest problem with this, however, is that Galileo was never tortured, nor was he imprisoned. In fact, when it was all said and done, his punishment ended up being house arrest with the Medici family. This family was one of the wealthiest and most powerful families in the history of Europe. Their colossal palace and the grounds surrounding them are where Galileo ended up serving his sentence. While it may be argued that it is messed up that he was put in this situation in the first place, no one can argue that he was put in a jail cell or beaten. This simply did not happen. For a popular account of this, you can read David Sobel's Galileo's Daughter, For a scholarly account, you can check out the work of Maurice Finnochario. He's one of the most eminent Galileo scholars in the world. Number 4. Alchemy and astrology are merely backward superstition that contributed nothing to the history of science. If there's one topic on this list that it's particularly hard for skeptics and critical thinkers to wrap their heads around, it's the idea that alchemy and astrology actually contributed something to the history of science. For large stretches of human history, however, they did just that. Alchemy and astrology motivated scholars to do what we would now today call astronomy and chemistry. Although at the time, there is no clear separation between astronomy and astrology, and alchemy and chemistry were essentially the same thing, with no delineation at all. For example, the great scholar Ptolemy invented all of his complicated astronomy in order to make him better at astrology. Unlike the modern astrologer, ancient astrologers and medieval astrologers mapped the location of every single object in the night sky, rather than just the sun and its position. This means that they needed very complicated techniques from things like trigonometry. They also, like the modern astronomer, put great emphasis on being able to use mathematics to predict where something is in the night sky. Something similar was true in the case of the alchemists. In their quest to create a philosopher's stone so that they could transmutate gold, they created many complex and interesting laboratory techniques. In fact, if you look at a picture of the equipment that they invented and regularly used, it bears a striking resemblance to the equipment that's still used today in colleges and chemistry departments. The modern chemist would also be familiar with many of the techniques they used. Alchemists regularly use things like distillation, sublimation, and crystallization in their research they conducted. These techniques and equipment also allowed alchemists to have many practical successes. They made new pigments, dyes, cosmetics, salt, glass, liquors, and metallic alloys. Besides these practical ends, they were also very key in the resurrection of atomic theory. While all this may seem trivial now, alchemy and astrology, in particular their emphasis on using math to make predictions and doing experiments in the lab, were arguably key forces in the creation of modern science. Number 5. Creationism is just an American phenomenon, in particular, a Southern evangelical phenomenon. Many smart people, including the great science popularizer and biologist Stephen Jay Gould, have repeated this myth. The people who make this argument say that creationism, despite being very worrisome, is a Southern American thing. In particular, it's believed by evangelical Christians, and that's pretty much it. Young Earth creationism certainly started off as an American phenomenon. I'll give them that. However, since its growth out of Seventh-day Adventism, creationism has spread all over the United States, not just the Southeast. One of the most famous trials involving creationism, for example, involved the variety called intelligent design. This trial did not happen in Alabama or Georgia or Texas, but Pennsylvania, which shows it is not just a Southern thing. It's also believed by many other people besides evangelical Christians. There are creationists in such religions as Roman Catholicism, Eastern Orthodoxy, Judaism, and Islam. Most alarmingly, however, creationism in its various forms have spread all over the globe. As documented by the historian Ronald Numbers in his book The Creationists, there are creationist strongholds in both first world and developing countries. Some of the nations in which creationists have the strongest foothold in are Australia, Turkey, Russia, and especially South Korea. Even though they're not the majority, they also have working institutes in countries like the United Kingdom and many German-speaking nations like Germany and Austria. To put it mildly, they're no longer just in Tennessee and Georgia. And with that said, that concludes this top 5. If you enjoyed it, then please like and subscribe below. You can also, if you're feeling particularly generous, contribute to my Patreon or send this link to a friend. And until next time, stay skeptical and thanks for listening.